Good morning. Welcome back to the OHSU Effect. I'm Lacey Evans. A lot of research is going on up at OHSU involving attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Most recently, researchers discovered there is a whole family of ADHD disorders. And one of those researchers is with me now, Dr. Damien Fair, an assistant professor in behavioral neuroscience and psychiatry in the Advanced Imaging Research Center. Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, so you conduct all sorts of ADHD research. Tell us about the scope of your research.
Well, we do a lot of work examining how kids typically develop, so how typically developing kids, how their brain changes and how their various types of psychological measures change over time, like their memory and attention and things like that. Then we also examine how this developmental trajectory may go awry in certain cases. And our primary focus is on ADHD, kids with ADHD, but we also study children with autism as well, and even adult populations with ADHD.
So, compared to other diseases, it seems like there's a lot more to learn when it comes to ADHD. Is that right?
Well, I think that in many different neuropsychiatric disorders, there's many things to learn because unlike other medical disciplines, psychiatry doesn't have empirical measurements like blood tests and brain scans and things of this nature that can easily characterize certain problems. And so in the field of psychiatry in general, there's many things to learn about how certain types of behavior are represented in the brain.
Tell us about your latest project.
What we were doing was taking a vast amount of kids that are typically developing and a large amount of kids who have been diagnosed with ADHD and determining whether there's essentially subgroups or subpopulations in the typical developing kids and the kids with ADHD that identify whether there's distinct groups, whether, in other words, are all kids with ADHD the same, or are there many different groups of kids that are maybe represent different populations. That was the primary goal of the work. And what we did was we had the kids come in and they do lots of different behavioral batteries. So we test their attention, we test how well their memory is, we test how fast they can respond to certain questions, we see how variable the types of responses. We do lots of different tests. All of these things in the past have been associated with as being poor performance in kids that have ADHD. But in this case, what we did was we took all the different measurements and we related them against all the different children, and we were trying to identify if we could find some kids that may be pretty good at memory tasks, but maybe not as good with attention. Other kids who may be very good with their attention spans, but not very good with working memory. We can parse these kids out like this, and we felt that maybe we could better characterize any given individual participant, and in the future maybe do a better job of personalizing the type of care that we give to certain children. What we found was that indeed we found these very unique subgroups where some kids were doing perfectly well, if not very good, on some tasks that have ADHD, and some kids were doing good on other different tasks and not as good in others. What was just as interesting is that we found the same types of subgroups in the normal population as well. And it's only when you think about all this vast variety and heterogeneity that exists in the population that we could see which kids had which specific problems.
It sounds like it means good news for families, right?
We think it does. Of course, there's always the immediate impact and kind of the long-term impact that we have to consider. With regard to how any given child is treated in the clinic, let's say now, there's not going to be a whole lot of change. But as we move forward, we're hoping to see whether this way of categorizing children can actually improve our ability to predict who's going to respond to certain types of therapies and who's not, and who's going to do better in this type of environment versus not. And so we think that in the long run, it could mean a very good thing for families because we'll have a better way to, like I said earlier, personalize the care of any given child.
And another interesting finding in your research is the various ways that kids with ADHD might perform. And in some areas, they actually perform better than children without ADHD, correct?
That's right. And this has been known actually for quite some time, is that it depends on the context a lot of times with kids with ADHD, but in some things they do better. But in this particular paper, what we what we were able to identify was that every child essentially has their strengths and weaknesses, and even the kids with ADHD, in some categories, depending on which subgroup or profile they're in, they could do better than another group, a different group of control kids or kids who were otherwise developing normally. And so it just highlights the amazing variety and the complexity of these types of disorders, and that we really have to parse some of the details out to hope to improve kind of our classification scheme and hopefully improve our way we treat and handle kids with certain types of developmental neuropsychiatric problems.
Are there still ways for families to participate in your research?
Absolutely. So we have several ongoing studies. We have one longitudinal study, which is also a brain imaging study, where we follow kids for several years, and the hope is that we can see how stable some of these subgroups and things that we're identifying are. This is work that is being led by Dr. Joel Nigg, who is a world-renowned ADHD clinician and scientist. We also have a study that's involving kids with ADHD, but also their siblings. So sometimes the siblings, even if they're otherwise developing normally, they may show signs or markers that we may be able to use to help predict outcomes in the future for even the sibling cases. That's work. That's a project that's being led by myself. And then we also have studies, very similar types of studies with kids with autism, and even adult ADHD studies where we're trying to look a little bit more deeply into the types of ways we deal with this type of problem in adult populations.
And
we have many opportunities, and of course, our studies don't just involve kids that are developing atypically, but kids that are developing typically as well.
And how can they contact you if they want to take part?
Right. So we have a primary number for our ADHD project. It's a toll-free number. You can call us 1-877-678-ADHD. We also have an email that is ohsuadhd@ohsu.edu, and from there, anybody that calls in will be able to be directed or be in touch with the correct people for any one of our given studies.
Great. Dr. Damien Fair, thank you.
Okay, thank you.